The grand doors of Lincoln Center swung open as Margaret Chun stepped out of her black limousine. The evening air was crisp, and the golden lights from the concert hall cast a warm glow across her face. She wore a stunning black evening gown that sparkled under the bright camera flashes, and her hair was pulled back in an elegant style that showed off her diamond earrings. Everything about her screamed success and fame. Margaret had worked hard to get to this moment. At 32, she was already being called one of the greatest pianists of her generation. Tonight's concert was completely sold out, with tickets going for hundreds of dollars each. People had traveled from all over the country just to hear her play. She knew she was good, and she wasn't shy about showing it as she walked up the red carpet. Reporters pushed forward with their microphones and cameras. Margaret, how does it feel to be performing at such a prestigious venue?" one reporter shouted. She stopped and smiled her practiced smile, the one she had perfected for photos and interviews. "It feels absolutely wonderful," she said, her voice confident and clear. "Lincoln Center has always been a dream venue for me. To finally be here, headlining my own show, it's everything I've worked for." She paused for effect, knowing exactly how to work the crowd. "Tonight, the audience will experience something truly special. I've prepared pieces that will showcase not just technical skill, but true artistry." The reporters ate it up, scribbling notes and asking more questions. Margaret loved this part almost as much as the actual performing. The attention, the admiration, the way people hung on her every word, it all fed something deep inside her. She had grown up in a middle-class family where nobody really understood her talent. Now finally, she was getting the recognition she deserved. More fans had gathered behind the ropes, holding programs and phones, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous pianist. Some called out her name, and she waved graciously, though she didn't really see them as individuals. They were just part of the background of her success. Proof that she had made it to the top. Inside the concert hall, the atmosphere was completely different. While Margaret basked in the spotlight outside, Eleanor Rodriguez pushed her cleaning cart down the long marble hallway. The wheels squeaked slightly as she moved, a sound that echoed in the mostly empty corridors. She wore the standard cleaning uniform, a simple blue shirt and dark pants, with comfortable shoes that had seen better days. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands showed the signs of years of hard work. Eleanor had been working at Lincoln Center for 8 years now. She started her shift at 4 in the afternoon and worked until midnight, long after the last audience member had gone home. She knew every corner of this building, every stain that needed special attention, every spot where dust liked to collect. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and she took pride in keeping this beautiful place clean. At 67, Eleanor moved a bit slower than she used to, but she was thorough. She understood that this place was special to a lot of people. Musicians came here to fulfill their dreams, and audience members came here for experiences they would remember forever. Her job was to make sure everything looked perfect for those moments. Tonight felt different, though. There was extra energy in the air because of the big concert. Eleanor had seen the name on the posters. Margaret Chun, she had heard some of the other staff talking about how talented this pianist was, how difficult it was to get tickets. Eleanor didn't know much about classical music these days, but she remembered when concerts like this used to mean something different to her. As she cleaned the marble floors near the main entrance, Eleanor could hear the commotion outside. The sounds of cameras clicking, people talking excitedly, car doors slamming. She had seen it all before with other famous performers. They would arrive in their fancy clothes and expensive cars, surrounded by people who treated them like royalty. Then they would disappear into their dressing rooms until showtime, in a world completely separate from people like her. Eleanor didn't feel bitter about it. That was just how things were. Some people were born into circumstances that led them to stages and spotlights, while others found their purpose in different ways. She had made peace with her life a long time ago. Even though it looked nothing like what she had once imagined for herself, the security guard at the door nodded to her as she worked nearby. "Big night tonight, Eleanor," he said with a smile. This pianist is supposed to be really something special. I'm sure she is, Eleanor replied, wringing out her mop in the bucket. The important thing is that everyone has a good time and gets home safely. That was Eleanor's way. She cared more about people than about fame or recognition. She had learned that real worth wasn't measured by applause or newspaper articles. It was measured by how you treated others and how you lived your daily life. Meanwhile, Margaret had finally made it inside the building. Her assistant and manager flanked her as they walked through the halls toward her dressing room. She moved quickly, her heels clicking against the floor that Eleanor had just finished cleaning. Margaret barely noticed the spotless surfaces around. To her, they were just supposed to be that way. The sound check went perfectly this afternoon, her manager was saying. The acoustics in this hall are incredible. You're going to sound amazing tonight. Margaret nodded, but her mind was already on the performance. She had practiced these pieces hundreds of times, but she still felt that familiar flutter of nerves, mixed with excitement. This was what she lived for, the moment when she would sit at that beautiful grand piano and show everyone what real talent looked like. As they walked past Eleanor, who was cleaning a nearby window, Margaret's assistant almost bumped into the cleaning cart. "Excuse me," the assistant said quickly, but Margaret didn't even slow down. To her, the cleaning lady was just part of the building, like the walls or the furniture. Invisible and unimportant, Eleanor stepped aside politely, waiting for the group to pass. She noticed how confident the young pianist looked, how everyone around her seemed to be hanging on her every word. Eleanor remembered what that felt like, to be the center of attention, to have people believe you were special. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. The contrast between these two women couldn't have been greater. One was about to step onto a stage, in front of hundreds of people who had paid good money to hear her play. The other would spend the evening making sure that stage and everything around it was perfect for someone else's moment of glory. Neither of them could have imagined that their paths would cross in a way that would change both of their lives. Forever, Margaret disappeared into her dressing room to prepare for the performance that she believed would be just another triumph in her successful career. Eleanor continued her work, moving quietly through the halls, invisible to most but essential to everything that happened in this place. The evening was just beginning, and neither woman knew that, before it was over, everything they thought they knew about music, talent, and human worth would be turned completely upside down. 2 hours before the concert was scheduled to begin, Margaret walked onto the empty stage for her final rehearsal. The concert hall stretched out before her like a vast ocean of red velvet seats, all waiting to be filled with people who had come to hear her play. The stage lights were dimmed, casting everything in a soft, golden glow that made the massive Steinway grand piano look almost magical. This was Margaret's favorite time, when the hall was quiet and she could have the stage all to herself. No audience, no pressure, just her and the music. She approached the piano like she was greeting an old friend, running her fingers along its polished black surface. This particular piano was worth more than most people made in several years, and she knew she was one of the few people in the world skilled enough to make it sing the way it was meant to. Margaret sat on the bench and adjusted it to the perfect height. She flexed her fingers, rolled her shoulders, and placed her hands on the keys. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the empty hall, echoing off the high ceiling and wrapping around the empty seats like silk. This was the piece she would close tonight's concert with. Technically challenging, emotionally complex, and guaranteed to leave the audience breathless. As she played, Margaret lost herself in the music. Her fingers moved across the keys with precision and grace, hitting every note exactly as she had practiced thousands of times. She knew this piece so well that she could play it in her sleep, but that didn't make it any less thrilling. Each time she performed it, she discovered something new, some small way to make it even more perfect. What Margaret didn't notice was that someone else had quietly entered the hall. Eleanor had finished cleaning the lobby areas and was now working on the main auditorium. She moved carefully between the rows of seats, checking for any trash or programs left behind from previous events, making sure everything was spotless. For tonight's audience, when Eleanor heard the piano music, she stopped what she was doing. The sound was absolutely beautiful, clear, and precise, with every note ringing out perfectly in the excellent acoustics of the hall. She had heard many rehearsals over the years while working here, but this pianist was clearly something special. The technical skill was obvious. Even to someone listening from the back of the hall, Eleanor set down her cleaning supplies and found herself drawn toward the sound. She moved quietly down the aisle, not wanting to disturb the rehearsal, but unable to resist getting closer to the music. As she got nearer to the stage, she could see the young woman at the piano, completely absorbed in her playing. Margaret's posture was perfect, her movements confident and controlled, but as Eleanor listened more carefully, something felt missing. The notes were all correct, the timing was flawless, but there was something about the interpretation that felt cold to her. It was like looking at a beautiful painting that had been created by following a set of instructions rather than coming from the heart. Technically perfect, but somehow lacking soul, Eleanor found herself stopping about halfway down the aisle, closing her eyes to listen more deeply. In her mind, she could hear how this piece could be played differently, with more warmth in the gentle passages, more passion in the dramatic sections. She had always believed that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time. It was about telling a story, sharing emotions, connecting with something deeper than just technique. Margaret was so focused on her playing that she didn't notice Eleanor at first. She was running through a particularly difficult section, making sure her fingering was perfect for tonight's performance. But something made her glance up, and she was startled to see someone standing in the aisle. Just watching her, Margaret's hand stumbled slightly, hitting a wrong note for the first time in months. The sound jarred her out of her musical focus, and she felt a flash of irritation. This was supposed to be her private rehearsal time. Who was this person, and what were they doing here? She stopped playing abruptly and turned toward Eleanor. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet hall. "This is a private rehearsal. Shouldn't you be cleaning somewhere else?" Eleanor's eyes opened quickly, and she realized she had been caught listening. She felt embarrassed for disturbing the rehearsal and quickly picked up her cleaning supplies. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't mean to interrupt. The music was just so beautiful, I got carried away listening." Margaret frowned. She wasn't used to being interrupted during rehearsals, especially not by cleaning staff. "Well, you did interrupt," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I need to concentrate, and I can't do that with people standing around staring at me." Eleanor nodded and began to move away, heading toward a different section of the hall. "Of course, I understand completely. I'll work in another area until you're finished." But Margaret wasn't ready to let it go. There was something about the way Eleanor had been standing there, the look on her face while listening, that bothered her. It was almost like the cleaning woman was judging her performance, which was ridiculous. What could someone like that possibly know about classical music? "Wait," Margaret called out. Eleanor stopped and turned back toward the stage. "How long were you standing there listening?" Eleanor seemed surprised by the question. "Not very long. Maybe just a few minutes. I really didn't mean to disturb you." "And what exactly were you doing? Just listening?" There was something in Margaret's tone that made Eleanor uncomfortable. She could hear the suspicion, maybe even accusation, in the younger woman's voice. "I was cleaning this section of the hall," Eleanor explained patiently. "When I heard the music, I stopped to listen for a moment. It's been a long time since I've heard Chopin played live." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You know Chopin?" Eleanor hesitated. She could see that Margaret was surprised, maybe even skeptical that a cleaning woman would recognize classical music. "A little," she said simply. "I used to listen to classical music quite a bit when I was younger." This answer seemed to annoy Margaret even more. There was something condescending about it, she thought. Like this woman was trying to pretend she understood something she clearly didn't. "Used to listen," Margaret repeated. "I see. Well, there's a big difference between listening to music and understanding what it takes to actually perform it at this level." Eleanor felt the sting of the comment but kept her voice calm. "You're absolutely right. There is a big difference." Margaret turned back to the piano, satisfied that she had made her point. But as she placed her hands on the keys again, she found that her concentration was broken. She kept glancing back to see if Eleanor was still there, still listening with that same focused expression. Eleanor continued her work, moving quietly between the rows of seats, but she couldn't help stealing occasional glances toward the stage. She tried to focus on her cleaning, but part of her mind was still thinking about the music she had heard. The technical skill was undeniable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing from the performance. Margaret started the piece again, but she felt self-conscious now. Every note seemed louder, every small imperfection magnified. She found herself wondering what the cleaning woman was thinking, which irritated her even more. Why should she care what someone like that thought about her playing? As Eleanor worked her way around the hall, she noticed Margaret glancing in her direction repeatedly. She could sense the tension she had created simply by being there, and she felt bad about it. The last thing she wanted was to make someone uncomfortable before an important performance, but Eleanor also felt something else, a sadness that came from recognizing a talented musician who seemed to have forgotten that music was about more than just technical perfection. She had seen it before, performers who were so focused on being flawless that they lost touch with the joy and emotion that made music meaningful in the first place. Margaret finished running through the piece, but it didn't feel as satisfying. As usual, the presence of the cleaning woman had somehow disrupted her usual confidence. She stood up from the piano bench, gathered her music, and walked toward the edge of the stage. "I'll be back in an hour for the final sound check," Margaret announced, speaking to no one in particular but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "I trust this area will be completely clear by then." Eleanor looked up from her work and nodded politely. "Of course. I'll make sure everything is perfect for your concert." As Margaret left the stage, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed during that rehearsal. For the first time in years, she had felt like someone was truly listening to her music, not just hearing the notes, but listening to something deeper. And for some reason, that thought made her more uncomfortable than she cared to admit. The first half of Margaret's concert had gone exactly as planned. Every note was perfect, every timing precise, and the audience had responded with enthusiastic applause after each piece. Margaret felt the familiar rush of satisfaction that came from a flawless performance. She had worked hard for this level of recognition, and tonight was proving once again that she deserved every bit of praise she received. During the 20-minute intermission, the concert hall buzzed with excitement. Well-dressed audience members stretched their legs, discussed the performance so far, and made their way to the elegant lobby for drinks and conversation. Many of them were wealthy patrons of the arts, the kind of people who attended these concerts as much to be seen as to hear the music. They wore expensive jewelry and designer clothes, and their conversations were filled with the names of famous musicians and exclusive venues. Margaret had changed into a different gown for the second half, a deep blue dress that sparkled under the stage lights. She felt confident and energized as she made her way through the backstage areas toward the green room where donors and VIP guests were gathered for a special meet and greet session. This was another part of her job that she had learned to enjoy, schmoozing with the people who funded these concerts and made her career possible. As she walked through the corridors, she passed by several staff members preparing for the second half of the show. Sound technicians were checking equipment, ushers were tidying up the seating areas, and security guards were positioned at their posts. And there, in a side hallway, was Eleanor, quietly mopping the floors that had been tracked with mud and moisture from the evening's foot traffic. Margaret slowed her pace as she approached. Something about seeing Eleanor again brought back the uncomfortable feeling she had experienced during rehearsal. The way the older woman had listened to her, playing with such focused attention, had stayed with her throughout the first half of the concert. It bothered her in a way she couldn't quite explain. "Still here, I see," Margaret said as she passed by Eleanor's work area. Eleanor looked up and offered a polite smile. "Yes, Miss Chun, The floors get quite dirty during intermission with all the people coming and going. How is your concert going? Perfectly as expected, Margaret replied, but she didn't keep walking. Instead, she paused, studying Eleanor's face. I noticed you were listening quite intently during my rehearsal earlier. Eleanor continued mopping, not wanting to seem like she was slacking off. Your playing is very skilled. The audience seems to be enjoying it very much. There was something about Eleanor's diplomatic response that irritated Margaret. It felt like the older woman was holding something back, not giving her the complete praise she was used to receiving. Very skilled, Margaret repeated. That's an interesting way to put it. Before Eleanor could respond, several people emerged from the green room nearby. Margaret recognized them immediately. Board members of the Lincoln Center Foundation, wealthy donors who contributed significant amounts of money to keep venues like this running. With them were a few other VIP guests, including a well-known music critic from the New York Times. Margaret, called out Mrs. Wellington, the foundation's chairwoman, a woman in her 60s who wore pearls and spoke with the confidence that comes from old money. There you are. We were just discussing how absolutely divine your performance has been tonight. Margaret's face lit up with a practiced smile as she turned toward the group, but she didn't move away from Eleanor's area. Thank you so much, Mrs. Wellington. It's always such a pleasure to perform in this magnificent hall. The group gathered around Margaret, full of compliments and questions about her upcoming tour dates. Mr. Harrison, a retired businessman who had funded several concerts this season, was particularly effusive in his praise. That Rachmaninoff piece in the first half was extraordinary. The way you handled those rapid passages, simply breathtaking. Margaret basked in the attention, but she was acutely aware that Eleanor was still working nearby, close enough to hear every word of the conversation. For some reason, having the cleaning woman as an audience to this praise session made her feel self-conscious again. Dr. Patterson, the music critic, adjusted his glasses and spoke in his carefully measured tone. Your technical precision is remarkable. Margaret, you have complete command of the instrument. It's rare to see such disciplined performance in someone so young. Thank you, Margaret said, feeling more confident now. I believe that technical mastery is the foundation of all great music. Without that precision, everything else falls apart. As the conversation continued, Eleanor tried to work quietly around the group, but the hallway was narrow and she couldn't avoid being in close proximity to the gathering. She kept her head down, focusing on her mop and bucket, trying to be as invisible as possible, but Margaret seemed determined not to let her be invisible. Perhaps it was the wine she had sipped during intermission, or maybe it was the rush of adrenaline from the successful first half, but Margaret found herself feeling bold and somewhat reckless. You know, Margaret said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, I had an interesting encounter during my rehearsal today. She glanced pointedly at Eleanor. I discovered we have quite the music enthusiast on the cleaning staff. The VIP guests looked around, confused, until they noticed Eleanor nearby. Mrs. Wellington raised an eyebrow. Oh, how so? Margaret's voice took on a tone that was friendly on the surface, but had an edge underneath. Well, it seems our friend here was quite captivated by my Chopin rehearsal. She even knows who Chopin is. Isn't that fascinating? Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm, but she continued working, hoping the conversation would move on to other topics. She could sense where this was heading, and it made her uncomfortable. Mr. Harrison chuckled in the way that wealthy people do when they think something is charming in a condescending way. How wonderful that the arts can reach everyone, even in unexpected places. Yes, Margaret continued, warming to her theme. It really makes you think about the different levels of musical appreciation, doesn't it? I mean, there's listening to music, and then there's truly understanding what goes into creating a performance at this level. Dr. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. The years of training, the sacrifices, the dedication required to reach professional standards, it's something most people can't fully comprehend. Margaret felt emboldened by the support of her audience. Exactly. Some people are born for greatness. For the stage, for sharing their gifts with the world, others. She paused dramatically, looking directly at Eleanor. Others are meant for different kinds of service. Both are important, of course, but we shouldn't confuse appreciation with actual understanding. The group murmured agreement, though a few of them looked slightly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Mrs. Wellington, who prided herself on being tactful, tried to steer things back to safer ground. Well, I'm sure we all appreciate good music in our own ways. But Margaret wasn't ready to let it go. The combination of adrenaline, alcohol, and audience had made her feel invincible, and Eleanor's quiet presence somehow challenged that feeling in a way that she wanted to address head-on. "I'm curious," Margaret said, turning fully toward Eleanor now. "What did you think of my interpretation of the Chopin, since you were listening so carefully?" Eleanor finally looked up from her work. The hallway had gone quiet except for the distant sounds of the audience returning to their seats for the second half. She could see that Margaret was putting her on the spot deliberately, trying to embarrass her in front of these important people. "I thought it was very well executed," Eleanor said quietly. "You clearly have excellent technical training." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Technical training? Yes, that's one way to look at it. Of course, there's so much more to professional performance than most people realize. The years of study, the understanding of musical theory, the ability to interpret complex compositions. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "It's not something you can just pick up from listening, is it?" Eleanor held Margaret's gaze steadily. "No, you're absolutely right. True musical education requires dedication and proper instruction." "I'm so glad you understand that," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's refreshing to meet someone who knows their place in the musical world." The silence that followed was uncomfortable for everyone present. Even Mrs. Wellington, who was used to navigating delicate social situations, seemed unsure how to respond. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat and checked his watch. "Well, perhaps we should head back to our seats," he suggested. "The second half will be starting soon." As the group began to disperse, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. She had made her point clearly. There was a hierarchy in the world of music, and everyone needed to understand where they belonged in it. Eleanor was obviously a nice enough woman, but it was important that she understood the difference between casual listening and real musical expertise. Eleanor watched the group walk away, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor she had just cleaned. She felt humiliated, not just by Margaret's words, but by the way the others had stood by and let it happen. She had spent decades learning to swallow her pride. The hallway fell quiet after Margaret and her group of admirers disappeared around the corner, their voices fading as they made their way back to the concert hall. Eleanor stood alone in the dimly lit corridor, still holding her mop, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had been publicly humiliated before. Working in service jobs for the past 25 years had taught her to expect a certain amount of dismissive treatment from people who thought they were better than her. She had learned to smile politely, nod when appropriate, and let the comments roll off her back. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the dismissal had been deliberate and cruel, designed to put her in her place in front of people who mattered. Eleanor set down her mop and leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. In her mind, she could still hear Margaret's voice, sweet on the surface, but poisonous underneath. It's refreshing to meet someone who knows their place in the musical world. The words stung more than Margaret could possibly know, because Eleanor did know her place in the musical world, or at least she had known it once upon a time, but that was a lifetime ago, and Eleanor had made peace with the choices that had led her here. Or so she had thought until tonight. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her open her eyes. Margaret was walking back toward her, alone this time. The VIP guests had apparently gone back to their seats, leaving Margaret to make her way to the stage for the second half of her concert. But instead of walking past, Margaret stopped directly in front of Eleanor. "I hope you weren't offended by our conversation back there," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she didn't really care if Eleanor was offended or not. "I wasn't trying to be rude. I just think it's important for people to understand the reality of what professional music requires." Eleanor looked up at Margaret, studying the younger woman's face. She could see the confidence there, the certainty that came from years of being told she was special and talented. But she could also see something else, a hardness that seemed wrong for someone so young, a coldness that suggested Margaret had never really learned to see other people as fully human. "You weren't being rude," Eleanor said quietly. "You were being honest about how you see the world." Margaret seemed satisfied with this response. "Exactly. I believe in honesty. Too many people these days are afraid to speak the truth because they're worried about hurting feelings. But facts are facts, aren't they?" "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Facts are facts. The fact is, I've spent my entire life preparing for nights like this." Margaret continued, apparently warming to her theme. "I started playing piano when I was 4 years old. I practiced hours every day while other kids were playing or watching television. I gave up parties and social events to focus on my music. I studied with the best teachers money could buy and competed against the most talented young musicians in the world." Eleanor nodded, listening carefully. She could hear the pride in Margaret's voice, but also something else, a defensive quality, as if Margaret was trying to convince herself as much as Eleanor. "By the time I was 16, I was performing with major orchestras," Margaret went on. "I won competitions that other musicians only dream of entering. I've recorded albums that have sold thousands of copies worldwide. I've performed in the most prestigious venues in Europe and Asia." "That's very impressive," Eleanor said, and she meant it. The dedication Margaret described was real, and the achievements were significant. "It is impressive," Margaret agreed. "And it's the result of natural talent combined with years of disciplined work. Not everyone is capable of that kind of commitment. Not everyone is born with the ability to truly understand music at the deepest level." Eleanor felt something shift inside her as Margaret spoke. The younger woman's words weren't just dismissive. They revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about what music really was and where it came from. Margaret seemed to believe that technical skill and professional success were the only measures of musical worth, that years of formal training were the only path to true understanding. "You're absolutely right," Eleanor said slowly. "Not everyone is born with natural talent." Margaret smiled, pleased that Eleanor was agreeing with her. "I knew you'd understand once I explained it properly. Some people are just meant for different things in life. And some people," Eleanor continued, her voice still quiet but gaining strength, "discover that life has different plans for them than the ones they originally made." Margaret looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath. For 25 years, she had kept her past to herself. She had learned to live in the present, to find dignity and purpose in whatever work she could find. She had made peace with being invisible, with being dismissed and overlooked by people who judged her worth by her current circumstances rather than her complete story. But standing here, listening to Margaret's confident pronouncements about who deserved to be part of the musical world and who didn't, Eleanor felt something awakening in her that had been sleeping for a very long time. "I mean," Eleanor said, looking directly into Margaret's eyes, "that you're absolutely correct about music requiring dedication and proper training. You're right that not everyone can achieve what you've achieved. You're right that there are different levels of musical understanding and ability." Margaret nodded, satisfied that she had made her point effectively. "But what you don't seem to understand," Eleanor continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, "is that music isn't about the clothes you wear or the venues you perform in or the titles that people give you. Music isn't about being better than other people or putting them in their place." Margaret's confident expression began to waver slightly. "I never said—" "Music," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly, "is about the connection between the performer and something larger than themselves. It's about taking the pain and joy and hope that live inside all of us and turning them into something beautiful that others can feel and understand. It's about serving something greater than your own ego." Margaret stared at Eleanor clearly, not expecting this kind of response from a cleaning woman. "That's a very romantic way of looking at it," she said, her tone becoming defensive. But the reality is that professional music requires specific skills and training that not everyone has access to. You're absolutely right about that too, Eleanor agreed. Professional music does require specific skills and training. I should know, you should know? Margaret repeated, confusion clear in her voice. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time all evening it was a genuine smile rather than the polite, careful expression she usually wore at work. Yes, I should know. Because 43 years ago, I was Eleanor Rodriguez Martinez, and I was the principal pianist for the Madrid Symphony Orchestra. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time, trying to process what she had just heard. I performed in this very hall when I was 24 years old, Eleanor continued, her voice calm and clear. I played the same Chopin piece you were rehearsing today, along with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the New York Times critic, not Dr. Patterson, but his predecessor wrote that my interpretation brought him to tears. Margaret was speechless, her confident facade crumbling as she tried to reconcile the image of the cleaning woman in front of her with the accomplished musician Eleanor was describing. I gave up my career when my daughter was born with severe disabilities, Eleanor went on. She needed round-the-clock care, and my husband was already working 2 jobs just to pay the medical bills. Someone had to choose between career and family, and I chose family. I've been working service jobs ever since, doing whatever I could to help support my daughter's care. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. But why didn't you? Why aren't you still ... Why am I not still performing professionally? Eleanor finished. Because life doesn't always work out the way we plan it. Because sometimes we have to make choices between what we want for ourselves and what the people we love need from us. Because there are more important things in this world than personal glory and recognition. Margaret stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process this information. Everything she had assumed about Eleanor, about her background, her intelligence, her right to have opinions about music, had been completely wrong. Music never left me, Eleanor said softly. It just took a different form. Instead of performing for audiences, I've spent the last 25 years singing lullabies to my daughter when she couldn't sleep because of her pain. Instead of competing for awards and recognition, I've found joy in the simple act of listening. Really listening to the music that fills this beautiful building every night. Eleanor picked up her mop again, but she didn't break eye contact with Margaret. You asked me earlier what I thought of your Chopin interpretation. You want to know the truth? Your technique is flawless, your timing is perfect. Your understanding of the musical structure is complete. But you play like someone who has forgotten that music is supposed to touch people's hearts, not just impress their minds. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Margaret stood in the hallway, her mouth slightly open, staring at Eleanor as if she had just witnessed something impossible. The confidence that had carried her through the evening, through years of performances and praise, seemed to have completely evaporated. She felt like she was looking at Eleanor for the first time, seeing a completely different person than the one she had dismissed just minutes earlier. You're saying you were a professional pianist? Margaret finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded calmly. I was. For 8 years, I performed with major orchestras across Europe and the United States. I made recordings that are probably still sitting in some music library somewhere, though I doubt anyone listens to them anymore. Margaret's mind raced, trying to process this information. It seemed impossible. The woman standing in front of her, wearing a simple cleaning uniform and holding a mop, had once been part of the same world that Margaret inhabited, had once stood on stages just like the one Margaret would return to in a few minutes. But how ... why ... The one Margaret would return to in a few minutes. How dot Margaret struggled to form coherent questions. Everything she thought she understood about class, about talent, about who deserved to be in the musical world, was crumbling around her. How did I end up here? Eleanor asked gently, understanding Margaret's confusion. Life happened. Real life. With real responsibilities and real choices that had to be made. Eleanor set her mop against the wall, and for a moment her posture changed. She stood straighter, and Margaret could almost see traces of the confident performer she must have once been. My daughter Isabella was born with cerebral palsy and severe intellectual disabilities. The doctors told us she would need constant care for the rest of her life. My husband worked construction, making barely enough to cover our basic expenses, let alone the medical bills that started piling up. Margaret listened, still struggling to reconcile this story with her assumptions about how the world worked. In her experience, talented people stayed talented, successful people stayed successful. The idea that someone could fall from professional performance to cleaning buildings seemed almost impossible to accept. I tried to keep performing for a while, Eleanor continued. I thought maybe I could balance both my career and caring for Isabella. But touring meant being away from home for weeks at a time, and Isabella needed someone who understood her medical needs. The babysitters we could afford didn't know how to handle her seizures or her feeding difficulties. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but Margaret could hear the old pain underneath the calm words. One night I was performing in Boston when Isabella had a particularly bad seizure. My husband called an ambulance, but he didn't know which medications she was allergic to. She nearly died because I wasn't there to advocate for her. Margaret felt something uncomfortable growing in her chest, a mixture of shame and something else she couldn't quite identify. So you quit? I made a choice, Eleanor corrected gently. I chose my daughter over my career. I chose love over recognition. I chose being present for the person who needed me most over pursuing my own dreams. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sounds of the audience settling back into their seats for the second half of the concert. Margaret realized she should be making her way to the stage, but she couldn't move. She was transfixed by Eleanor's story, by the calm way she spoke about giving up everything Margaret valued most. Weren't you angry? Margaret asked. Didn't you resent having to give up everything you'd worked for? Eleanor considered the question carefully. At first, yes. I was furious at the unfairness of it all. I was angry at God, at fate, at the circumstances that forced me to choose. I mourned for the career I'd lost, for the music I wouldn't get to share with the world. But, Margaret sensed there was more to the story. But I discovered something I hadn't expected, Eleanor said, a small smile crossing her face. I learned that there are different ways to be musical, different ways to serve beauty in the world. Singing Isabella to sleep when she was in pain became its own kind of performance. Teaching her to clap along to simple songs became its own kind of masterclass. Margaret shook her head, unable to understand. But that's not the same thing. That's not that's not real music, not professional music. Eleanor studied Margaret's face, seeing the genuine confusion there. What do you think makes music real, Margaret? Is it the size of the audience? The price of the tickets? The reviews in fancy newspapers? It's about excellence, Margaret said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. It's about reaching the highest levels of artistic achievement. It's about sharing your gift with the world in the most meaningful way possible. And you think the only meaningful way to share music is on a concert stage? Margaret paused, realizing she was walking into territory she hadn't fully thought through. Well, I mean, if you have real talent, if you have the ability to perform at the highest levels, don't you have an obligation to do that? Isn't it almost wasteful not to? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see her thinking carefully about how to respond. Can I tell you about the last time I performed professionally? Margaret nodded, grateful to step back from the philosophical questions that were making her uncomfortable. It was at Carnegie Hall, actually. I was performing Brahms' Piano Concerto. No, one with the New York Philharmonic. It was supposed to be the biggest night of my career up to that point. I had practiced for months, and I knew the piece perfectly. Eleanor's eyes took on a distant look, as if she was seeing that night again. But right before I went on stage, I got a call from home. Isabella had been crying all day, and my husband couldn't calm her down. She was calling for Mama over and over again, and nothing he tried was working. Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite herself. I went out on that stage and played every note perfectly, Eleanor continued. The audience gave me a standing ovation. The critics wrote glowing reviews. By every measure that matters in the professional music world, it was a complete success. But, the whole time I was playing, all I could think about was my little girl at home, crying for me. I realized that no amount of applause could compete with the knowledge that someone I loved needed me and I wasn't there. Margaret felt a strange tightness in her throat. So you just walked away from all of it? I finished my contractual obligations and then, yes, I walked away. I came home to Isabella, and I've been with her ever since. She's 43 now, and she still needs constant care, but she's the light of my life. Don't you miss it? Margaret asked. The performing. The recognition, the importance of it all? Eleanor smiled, and this time it was a full, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. I thought I would. I thought I'd spend my life regretting what I'd given up. But you know what I discovered? The most important music I ever made wasn't in Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. It was in Isabella's bedroom at 3 a.m, singing her back to sleep after a seizure. It was teaching her to hum along with songs on the radio. It was the laughter we shared when she would clap off beat, but with pure joy. Margaret stared at Eleanor, trying to process what she was hearing. Everything about Eleanor's story challenged the fundamental beliefs that had driven Margaret's entire life. The idea that someone could voluntarily walk away from professional success, that they could find fulfillment in obscurity, that love could be more important than achievement. It was almost incomprehensible to her. But your talent, Margaret said weakly. All that training, all that ability, wasn't it wasted? Eleanor shook her head firmly. Talent is never wasted when it's used to serve love. The music I made for Isabella was just as real, just as meaningful as anything I ever played on a concert stage. Maybe more so, because it came from a place of pure love rather than a desire for recognition. Margaret felt something cracking inside her chest, some certainty that had always seemed unshakable. Standing in this hallway, talking to this woman she had so thoroughly misjudged, she was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about music, about success, about what it meant to live a meaningful life, and the most terrifying part was that she was starting to suspect that Eleanor might be right. Margaret stood in the hallway, her entire worldview shifting like sand beneath her feet. The woman in front of her had just shattered every assumption she had made about talent, success, and what it meant to be a true musician. But even as Eleanor's story sank in, Margaret felt a desperate need to regain control of the situation, to find some way back to the certainty she had felt just minutes before. That's a very touching story, Margaret said, her voice strained as she tried to maintain her composure. And I'm sure you were a competent pianist in your time. But surely you understand that being away from music for over 20 years. She let the sentence hang in the air, hoping Eleanor would fill in the obvious conclusion. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying Margaret's face. She could see the younger woman struggling, fighting against the uncomfortable truth that her prejudices had been completely wrong. You think I've lost my ability, Eleanor said simply. Well, it's only natural, Margaret said, gaining confidence as she found familiar ground. Music at the professional level requires constant practice, constant refinement. The fingers lose their dexterity, the mind loses its sharpness. It's not a criticism, it's just reality. Margaret was warming to her theme now, desperate to re-establish the hierarchy that made sense to her. I practice 6 hours a day every single day. I work with coaches and attend master classes constantly. That's what it takes to maintain performance. Quality at the highest levels. Someone who's been away from music for decades simply can't Can't what? Eleanor asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. She wanted to say, can't possibly still be able to play at a professional level, but something in Eleanor's calm demeanor made her cautious. Can't be expected to maintain the same standards, she finished carefully. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. You're probably right. 25 years is a long time to be away from professional performance. Margaret felt a surge of relief. Finally, Eleanor was acknowledging reality. Exactly. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Skills fade without constant use. That's just how it works. Of course, Eleanor agreed. Though I should mention that I never said I stopped playing entirely. Margaret's relief faltered. What do you mean? I mean, I may have stopped performing professionally, but I never stopped playing. Isabella loves music, even though she can't express it the way most people do. I've played for her every single day for the past 25 years. Not concert pieces, usually simple songs, lullabies, folk tunes that make her smile. Margaret felt the ground shifting again, but she pressed on. But that's not the same thing. Playing simple songs for someone who can't really appreciate complex music that's not maintaining professional skills. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught a flash of something in her eyes. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of quiet steel. You think my daughter can't appreciate music because of her disabilities? I didn't mean ... Margaret started, realizing she had said something offensive, but not entirely sure what. Isabella may not be able to speak or walk or care for herself, Eleanor said, her voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. But she knows the difference between music that comes from the heart and music that's just technically correct. She can sense emotion in a way that might surprise you. Margaret felt herself growing defensive. I'm sure she's very sweet, but we're talking about professional-level music here. Complex classical pieces that require years of training to even understand, let alone perform. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret thought she had finally made her point successfully. But then Eleanor spoke, and her words cut through Margaret's confidence like a knife. You really believe that, don't you? You genuinely think that music is only meaningful if it's technically complex and performed for educated audiences. I think music at the highest levels requires proper training and constant practice, Margaret said firmly. I think there's a difference between playing around casually and performing professionally. And you think someone like me, someone who spent the last 25 years playing lullabies for a disabled child, couldn't possibly still have the skills for real music? Margaret hesitated. Something about the way Eleanor phrased the question felt like a trap, but she couldn't see any way around the obvious truth. I think it's extremely unlikely, she said carefully. Eleanor nodded slowly. I see. So, in your opinion, if I were to sit at a piano right now and attempt to play something challenging, let's say, the same Chopin piece you were rehearsing today, what do you think would happen? Margaret felt more confident now. This was territory. She understood. Honestly, I think you probably remember parts of it, but the technical demands would be beyond what you could manage after so many years away from serious practice. The finger work alone ... Your work, Eleanor repeated. Yes, that's very important in Chopin, extremely important. The rapid passages, the delicate touch required for the softer sections, the stamina needed for the dramatic climaxes. These things take years to develop and constant practice to maintain. Eleanor looked down at her hands, the same hands that Margaret had earlier dismissed as belonging to someone who couldn't possibly understand real music. They were worn from years of manual labor, with small scars and calluses that spoke of hard work and sacrifice. These hands have cleaned thousands of floors, Eleanor said quietly. They've changed countless bedsheets and scrubbed toilets and lifted my daughter when she couldn't move herself. They've worked in kitchens and laundromats and office buildings. Margaret nodded, thinking Eleanor was proving her point. But you know what else these hands have done? Eleanor continued, looking back up at Margaret. They've never stopped making music. Every single day for 25 years, they've found piano keys. Sometimes it was the old upright piano in our apartment. Sometimes it was the electric keyboard in Isabella's therapy center. Sometimes it was just the imaginary keys I played on her bedside table while she slept. Margaret felt a flicker of uncertainty, but she pushed it aside. Playing simple songs on an old piano isn't the same as maintaining concert-level technique. You're absolutely right, Eleanor said. It's not the same at all. Playing for Isabella required something different, something you might not understand. What do you mean? Eleanor smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Margaret deeply uncomfortable. It required me to remember why I fell in love with music in the first place. Not for the applause or the reviews or the recognition, but for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. Isabella taught me to play with my heart instead of just my head. Margaret shook her head. Heart doesn't matter if the technique isn't. Music at the professional level is about precision, about executing complex passages flawlessly. Is it? Eleanor asked. Is that really what music is about? Before Margaret could answer, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. You know what? You're probably right. After all these years, I probably couldn't play the Chopin piece the way it's supposed to be played. Margaret felt vindicated, but Eleanor wasn't finished. But I'm curious now. You've made such a compelling case about why someone like me couldn't possibly perform at your level anymore. Would you be willing to put that theory to the test? Margaret blinked, confused. What do you mean? Eleanor gestured toward the concert hall. I mean, would you be willing to let me try? Right now in front of everyone? Margaret stared at Eleanor, her mouth falling open slightly. You want to perform? Tonight? In front of the audience? Why not? If you're right, if I really have lost the ability to play at a professional level, then it would prove your point conclusively. Everyone would see that there really is a difference between someone who maintains their skills and someone who's been away from serious music for decades. Margaret felt trapped. Everything logical told her that Eleanor couldn't possibly perform a challenging piece after so many years away from professional music. But something about Eleanor's calm confidence was making her nervous. That's not how concerts work, Margaret said weakly. You can't just walk onto a stage and play. There are protocol schedules. Oh, I'm not suggesting I replace your performance, Eleanor said gently. I'm suggesting a different kind of demonstration. You could present it as a teaching moment, showing the audience the difference between professional and amateur playing. You could even play the piece first, showing how it should be done, and then I could attempt it afterward. Margaret felt her heart racing. The logical part of her brain knew that accepting this challenge was insane. But her pride, the same pride that had driven her to humiliate Eleanor in front of the VIP guests, wouldn't let her back down from what seemed like an obvious victory. You're serious about this, Margaret said, completely serious. Unless of course you're not confident enough in your own abilities to risk the comparison. And with those words, Eleanor had laid down a challenge that Margaret's ego wouldn't allow her to refuse. Margaret stared at Eleanor for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing through the implications of what had just been proposed. Accept the challenge, and she risked public embarrassment if somehow Eleanor could still play. Refuse, and she would look like a coward who couldn't back up her confident words. Her pride, which had gotten her into this situation, now seemed determined to seal her fate. Fine, Margaret said, the word coming out sharper than she intended. If you really think you can perform Chopin's Ballade No. 1 at a professional level, after 25 years away from serious music, then let's settle this once and for all. Eleanor nodded calmly, as if she had expected this response. How would you like to arrange it? Margaret's mind worked quickly. She needed to control the situation, to make sure that when Eleanor inevitably failed, it would be clear to everyone exactly what the failure meant. I'll go back on stage and announce to the audience that we have a special demonstration tonight. I'll explain that we're going to show the difference between professional training and amateur enthusiasm. That sounds fair, Eleanor agreed, though something in her tone suggested she understood exactly what Margaret was trying to do. "I'll perform the piece first," Margaret continued, warming to her plan. "Then you can attempt it. The audience will be able to hear the difference immediately." Eleanor smiled, and Margaret noticed for the first time that it wasn't the polite, deferential smile of a service worker. It was the confident smile of someone who knew something important that others didn't. "I think that's an excellent idea." 10. Minutes later, Margaret stood at the center of the Lincoln Center stage, looking out at an audience that was buzzing with curiosity. Word had somehow spread during the brief intermission that something unusual was about to happen, and the energy in the hall was electric with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics, "tonight we have an unexpected opportunity for a unique musical demonstration." She gestured toward the wings where Eleanor waited, now wearing a simple black dress that one of the stagehands had found for her. Someone had also helped her fix her hair, and the transformation was remarkable. Standing in the shadows, Eleanor looked like what she had once been, a professional musician preparing for a performance. "We're going to explore the difference between formal musical training and natural musical appreciation," Margaret continued, choosing her words carefully. "I'll be performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, and then we'll hear the same piece interpreted by someone who learned to love music through life experience rather than formal study." The audience murmured with interest. This was clearly not what they had expected when they bought their tickets, but the novelty of the situation had captured their attention completely. Margaret walked to the piano and took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her position, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. As always, her technique was flawless. Every note rang out with crystal clarity, every phrase shaped with mathematical precision. The difficult passages flowed effortlessly under her fingers, and the dramatic moments built with calculated intensity. But as she played, Margaret found herself thinking about Eleanor's words from earlier in the evening, about music coming from the heart rather than just the head, about playing for someone who needed comfort rather than applause. Despite herself, she began to wonder if there was something missing from her own interpretation, something she had never noticed before. She pushed the thought away and focused on the technical demands of the piece. This was what mattered: the precision, the control, the flawless execution that separated professionals from amateurs. When she finished, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause, just as they always did. Margaret stood and bowed, then turned toward the wings. "And now," she announced, "please welcome Eleanor Rodriguez." Eleanor walked onto the stage with a calm dignity that surprised many in the audience. She didn't hurry or seem nervous, despite the unusual circumstances. She nodded graciously to Margaret, who stepped aside but remained on stage to witness what she was certain would be a demonstration of the difference between real talent and wishful thinking. Eleanor approached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting lightly on its polished surface. She looked out at the audience, hundreds of people who had paid significant money to hear professional quality music, now watching a cleaning woman attempt to play one of classical music's most challenging pieces. "Before I begin," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly without amplification, "I want to dedicate this performance to my daughter Isabella, who taught me that the most beautiful music comes from love, not from seeking approval." The audience fell completely silent. There was something in Eleanor's voice, a quiet confidence and deep emotion, that commanded attention in a way that Margaret's technical announcements never had. Eleanor sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. She flexed her fingers, those same hands that Margaret had dismissed as belonging to someone who couldn't understand real music. For a moment, she simply sat with her hands resting on the keys, eyes closed, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Then she began to play. The first notes of the ballade filled the hall, and immediately everyone could sense that something extraordinary was happening. Eleanor's technique was indeed flawless. Her years away from professional performance hadn't dulled her technical abilities at all. But that wasn't what made the audience collectively hold their breath. It was the emotion. Every note seemed to carry the weight of 25 years of love, sacrifice, and hard-won wisdom. Where Margaret's performance had been precise and controlled, Eleanor's was alive with feeling. The gentle passages spoke of tender moments with a beloved child. The dramatic sections conveyed not just technical mastery, but the pain and joy of a life fully lived. Margaret stood frozen at the side of the stage, listening to her signature piece being transformed into something she had never imagined it could be. This wasn't just technically proficient playing, this was storytelling at the highest level. Emotion made audible, a human heart speaking directly to other human hearts through the language of music. As Eleanor played, Margaret could see the audience responding in ways they never had to her own performances. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed. She could see tears on some faces, and others had their eyes closed as if they were being transported to another world entirely. The difficult passages that Margaret prided herself on executing perfectly were handled by Eleanor with an ease that made them seem effortless. But more importantly, they were woven into the emotional narrative of the piece in a way that made every technical challenge serve the music rather than dominate it. Margaret realized she was witnessing something she had never experienced before. Music being played, not for the sake of demonstrating skill, but for the pure purpose of sharing something beautiful and meaningful with others. Eleanor wasn't performing to prove anything or to impress anyone. She was simply offering a gift, sharing the deepest part of herself through the medium of music. As the piece built toward its climax, Eleanor's playing grew more intense but never lost its emotional center. The passionate sections spoke of struggles, overcome in love that endured through hardship. The quiet moments that followed seemed to offer comfort and peace to everyone listening. When Eleanor played the final notes, the silence that followed was profound. It lasted for what felt like minutes, as if the entire audience was reluctant to break the spell that had been cast over the hall. Then slowly, the applause began. But this wasn't the polite, appreciative applause that usually followed classical performances. This was something deeper, people rising to their feet spontaneously, many with tears streaming down their faces, applauding not just for technical skill but for having been touched by something transcendent. Margaret stood at the side of the stage, her own eyes filled with tears she didn't understand, watching Eleanor acknowledge the standing ovation with the same calm grace she had shown throughout the entire evening. For the first time in her career, Margaret understood the difference between playing music and being music. And she realized that everything she thought she knew about her art, about success, about what it meant to be a musician, had been fundamentally wrong. Eleanor had just given her the most important lesson of her life, and Margaret finally understood that she had been completely and utterly speechless, not because Eleanor couldn't play, but because Eleanor had just shown her what music was truly meant to be. The thunderous applause seemed to go on forever, washing over the stage in waves that grew stronger rather than weaker as more people rose to their feet. Margaret had never heard anything quite like it in all her years of performing. This wasn't the polite appreciation she was used to receiving, or even the enthusiastic response that followed her most technically challenging pieces. This was something raw and emotional, the sound of hundreds of people who had been genuinely moved by what they had just witnessed. Eleanor stood beside the piano, accepting the ovation with a quiet grace that only made the moment more powerful. She didn't bow dramatically or gesture to the audience like most performers did. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the piano, smiling with the kind of peaceful contentment that comes from having shared something deeply personal and meaningful. Margaret remained frozen at the side of the stage, watching this scene unfold with a mixture of emotions she couldn't begin to process. Shock, certainly. Embarrassment at how wrong she had been about Eleanor's abilities. But underneath those obvious feelings was something much more complicated. A profound sense of loss for something she was only now realizing she had never had. As the applause finally began to die down, Eleanor turned toward Margaret. Their eyes met across the stage, and Margaret saw no trace of triumph or vindication in Eleanor's expression. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like compassion, as if Eleanor understood exactly what Margaret was going through in this moment. Eleanor walked across the stage toward Margaret, moving with the same unhurried dignity she had shown all evening. When she reached Margaret's side, she extended her hand, not in a gesture of victory, but in what seemed like an offer of friendship. Margaret stared at the outstretched hand for a moment, then slowly reached out to take it. As their hands touched, she felt something crumble inside her chest, some wall she had built up over years of competition and achievement and constant striving to prove herself better than others. Margaret started to speak, but found that her voice wouldn't work properly. The words she had always been so good with, the confident statements and clever observations that had served her well in interviews and social situations, seemed to have completely abandoned her. Eleanor squeezed Margaret's hand gently. "It's all right," she said quietly, speaking just loud enough for Margaret to hear over the continuing applause. "I know this is a lot to process." Margaret tried again to find words, any words that could express what she was feeling. "You're playing, I had no idea. I mean, I never expected—" "You never expected someone like me to be able to play like that," Eleanor finished gently. Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I was so wrong about everything, about you, about music, about what really matters." She paused, struggling to continue. "I don't even know how to apologize for the way I treated you tonight." Eleanor smiled, and it was the same warm, genuine smile that Margaret had failed to notice when she first encountered her cleaning the floors hours earlier. "You don't need to apologize. You're not the first person to make assumptions about me, based on my current circumstances, and you won't be the last." "But I was so cruel," Margaret insisted. "The way I spoke to you in front of those people, the things I said about knowing your place in the musical world." "You were defending something you believed in," Eleanor said. "You thought music belonged only to people who fit a certain mold, who had followed a certain path. It's an understandable mistake." Margaret shook her head. "No, it's not understandable. It's inexcusable. I let my ego and my prejudices blind me to who you really are." The audience was finally settling back into their seats, though the energy in the hall remained electric. People were talking excitedly to their companions, clearly processing what they had just experienced. Margaret could hear fragments of conversation from the front rows, words like extraordinary and life-changing and never heard anything like it. Eleanor looked out at the audience, then back at Margaret. "Can I tell you something? When I was your age, performing professionally, I probably would have reacted the same way you did tonight." Margaret looked at her skeptically. "I don't believe that." "It's true," Eleanor said. "I was so focused on proving that I belonged in the professional music world that I forgot why I had fallen in love with music in the first place. I measured everything by technical standards and professional recognition. I thought that was what separated real musicians from everyone else. What changed?" Margaret asked. Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "Isabella changed everything. When I realized that I was going to have to choose between my career and caring for her, I went through a period where I was angry at music itself. I felt like it had betrayed me, like all those years of training and sacrifice had been for nothing." Margaret listened intently, hanging on every word. "But then one night, when Isabella was about 6 months old, she was crying inconsolably. Nothing I tried would calm her down, not feeding, not changing her diaper, not rocking her. I was exhausted and frustrated, and I started to cry too." Eleanor paused, lost in the memory. "Almost without thinking, I started humming a simple lullaby my mother used to sing to me. Nothing fancy, no complex harmonies or sophisticated rhythms. Just a simple melody that came from my heart. And Isabella stopped crying," Margaret guessed. "She did more than that," Eleanor said, her eyes brightening. "She looked at me with this expression of pure wonder, as if she was hearing the most beautiful sound in the world. And in that moment I realized that music isn't about impressing people or proving your worth. It's about connecting with others at the deepest possible level." Margaret felt fresh tears starting to fall. "I've been playing music for almost 30 years, and I've never felt that kind of connection with an audience." "Because you've been playing for yourself," Eleanor said gently. "For your ego, for recognition, for proof that you're special and talented. There's nothing wrong with wanting those things, but they're not what music is really about. Then what is it about? Margaret asked, genuinely wanting to understand. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Music is about love? Love for the beauty of the sounds themselves? Love for the people who hear you play? Love for something bigger than yourself that you can serve through your art? Margaret thought about her own performances, trying to remember if she had ever felt that kind of love while playing. Mostly, she realized she had felt focused on technique, worried about making mistakes, eager for applause and recognition. Even when she played pieces she supposedly loved, she was usually thinking more about how she was playing them than about what they meant, or what they could mean to others. "I don't know how to play that way," Margaret admitted. "I don't know how to stop thinking about technique and recognition and just connect." Eleanor smiled. "It's not something you can force or fake. It has to come naturally from a place of genuine humility and openness." "Humility," Margaret repeated. "That's not exactly my strong suit." "Tonight was a good start," Eleanor said with a gentle laugh. "Nothing teaches humility quite like having all your assumptions completely shattered." Margaret managed a weak smile. "Is that what just happened to me? What do you think?" Margaret looked out at the audience, many of whom were still discussing Eleanor's performance with obvious excitement. She thought about her own earlier performance, technically perfect, but somehow forgettable compared to what Eleanor had just shared. She thought about the way she had treated Eleanor throughout the evening, the assumptions she had made, the cruelty she had shown. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that I just learned I'd been living my entire musical life completely backwards." Eleanor nodded. "That's a painful realization, but it's also the beginning of real growth." "Where do I go from here?" Margaret asked. "How do I start over when I'm 32 years old and I've built my entire identity around being better than other people?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "You don't have to start over completely. You have incredible technical skills and years of valuable training. But maybe you can start thinking about how to use those gifts differently. Instead of playing to prove how talented you are, maybe you can play to give something beautiful to others." Margaret felt a strange mixture of hope and terror at the suggestion. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built her sense of self around, would have to be questioned and possibly rebuilt from the ground up. "It won't be easy," Eleanor continued. "Changing the way you approach something as fundamental as your art takes time and patience with yourself." "Will you help me?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the question. "I mean, I know I have no right to ask after the way I treated you, but Eleanor's smile was radiant. "Of course I'll help you. Music is meant to be shared, and that includes sharing what we've learned about how to approach it with love instead of ego." As the two women stood together on the stage, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of peace. That came not from being better than others, but from the possibility of being part of something larger than herself. The audience was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, still processing what they had witnessed.